Doctor, look at him there. As his handler shut his mouthpiece out. Dr. Shepard's coming over to look.
22 horrific sports accidents, 7 levels. From a snowmobile pro who got crushed by his own vehicle to a boxing match that turned into a televised death. These are 22 of the most traumatic and messed up sports accidents ever seen. The further we get into the iceberg, the more horrific the disaster. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. 2020 MotoGP motorcycle. On lap 9 of the 2020 Austrian Grand Prix, Johann Zarco was trailing Franco Morbidelli down the straight leading to turn 3. Both of them were hitting speeds of roughly 300 kilometers per hour when Zarco pulled alongside Morbidelli in the left-hand kink before the corner. Zarco completed his overtaking maneuver and immediately drifted wide toward the center of the track, crossing directly into Morbidelli's racing line. But with the aerodynamic slipstream effect at those speeds, Morbidelli found himself with nowhere to go. His front wheel clipped Zarco's rear tire, sending both riders tumbling across the asphalt at nearly 200 miles per hour. The riders hit the ground hard, but their motorcycles kept going. That's 2 unmanned machines, each weighing over 150 kilograms, continuing to hurtle toward turn 3 at lethal velocity. If they were to get hit by one of these bikes, that was the end of their lives. Zarco's Ducati smashed into the air fence barriers but somehow launched over them, becoming airborne. Morbidelli's Yamaha skidded across the grass, maintaining its straight-line trajectory directly toward the apex of turn 3. At that exact moment, Valentino Rossi and Maverick Viñales were leaning into the corner, completely unaware of the bikes racing toward them. Rossi later described feeling something approaching and initially thinking it was a helicopter's shadow. Let's just get scientific here for a moment so you can understand how insane of a close call this was. Morbidelli's bike crashed through the narrow gap between the two riders at 76 kilometers per hour, missing Rossi by just 20 centimeters. Zarco's bike flew directly over Viñales' helmet by mere centimeters. Scientific analysis revealed that if Rossi hadn't braked just 0.42 seconds earlier, the impact would have been catastrophic. That's less than half a second, and this thing could have been a tragedy. Somehow, all 4 riders walked away. Zarco suffered friction burns and a fractured scaphoid, while Morbidelli escaped with minor injuries. The race was immediately red-flagged, but the image of 2 riderless motorcycles threading between human targets at highway speeds remains one of MotoGP's most insane and terrifying near misses. Dale Earnhardt. It was February 18th, 2001, the final lap of NASCAR's biggest race. Dale Earnhardt was running third, chasing his own cars. Michael Waltrip and Dale's own son, Dale Jr., held first and second. The Intimidator, as he was known to his fans, had won at Daytona 34 times, but somehow never captured the 500. Well, this looked like his team's moment. As turn 4 approached, Sterling Marlin, running behind Earnhardt on the inside, made contact with the left rear of the black number 3 car. Nothing dramatic at first, just racing contact that happens every week. But this time, physics was not on their side. Earnhardt's car slid down the steep banking toward the infield, the kind of slide drivers have corrected hundreds of times before. He yanked the wheel right, snapping the car back up the track at a sharp angle, but Ken Schrader, running on the outside lane, had nowhere to go. The collision sent Earnhardt's car directly into the retaining wall at an estimated 155 to 160 miles per hour. The impact angle was catastrophic, creating forces equivalent to dropping from 61.8 feet in the air. His hood pins severed on impact, sending the hood slamming repeatedly against the windshield. Both of the cars slid down into the infield grass. Schrader climbed out uninjured and rushed to check on Earnhardt, but when he pulled down the window net, he immediately signaled frantically for paramedics. Later, Schrader would reveal what he saw, saying, "When I went up to the car, I knew he was dead." While Waltrip celebrated his first NASCAR victory, Earnhardt was cut from his mangled car and rushed to Halifax Medical Center. At 5:16 p.m., Doctors pronounced him dead from a Balliser's skull fracture. NASCAR responded quickly, mandating Hans devices to prevent head whipping and ordering safer barriers to replace concrete walls at oval tracks. The car of tomorrow was developed with enhanced safety features. Since these changes, no Cup Series driver has died in competition. Level 2. Andrew Cotton. Andrew Cotton was not your typical Englishman. He was a plumber from North Devon who started surfing at 7, spending his 20s chasing bigger and bigger waves until the pursuit consumed everything else. By 2017, he was towing surfing legends like Garrick McNamara into world record waves at Nazaré, Portugal, establishing himself as one of the planet's elite big wave riders. His ambition drove him to it. November 8th started like any other session at Nazaré. Cotton was out with Hugo Vau and McNamara, taking turns between surfing and driving safety skis. The waves were massive but manageable, especially for those with a certain degree of experience. Cotton had already caught several waves when he spotted what looked like the perfect left-hand barrel. He let go of the tow rope and dropped into the wave, but something went wrong immediately. The wave changed shape in seconds, transforming from a rideable barrel into a closing death trap. Through it all, Cotton found himself in the worst possible position as tons of water prepared to detonate directly above him. The impact launched him 40 feet through the air, yet he had no idea he was airborne, no chance to prepare for what came next. When he hit the water, it was like landing on concrete, the force instantly fracturing his L2 vertebrae. Pain shot through his back and down his leg, leaving him unable to swim or move. Just when it seemed like the situation could not get worse, a second wave immediately broke on top of him. Cotton remained underwater for 25 seconds before Hugo Vau managed the treacherous rescue. But at the hospital, X-rays confirmed that his spine was severely broken. He spent months in a rigid back brace, unable to walk initially. The wipeout was so spectacular, it eventually won him the WSL's 2018 Wipeout of the Year award, which seems unnecessarily cruel to me. Either way, the incident became a watershed moment for big wave safety discussions across the global surfing community. As for Cotton, his recovery took 9 long months of intensive rehabilitation work. He returned to big waves in 2018, only to blow out his knee weeks later. Probably got a Wipeout award for that one too, actually. But, the greatest award for us is if you hit that subscribe button. So why not do that while we head to the next level? Level 3. Ayrton Senna, F1 Racing. The weekend at Imola was already surprisingly bloody even before Ayrton Senna even climbed into his Williams on that May morning in 1994. Roland Ratzenberger had died the day before during qualifying after his car slammed into concrete at Villeneuve Corner. Senna had won 3 times before. He knew the dangers lurking at every turn of the Autodromo Enzo Edino Ferrari better than anybody, especially the flat-out Tamburello corner that drivers called a crooked straight. On lap 7, traveling at 309 kilometers per hour, Senna's steering column snapped. The car shot straight off the racing line, becoming a helpless projectile aimed at an unprotected concrete barrier. Telemetry showed he braked hard, downshifting twice in desperation, but physics had already written the ending of this particular story. The car slammed into the wall at 211 kilometers per hour. The right front wheel tore away from the car and rocketed upward, entering the cockpit like a cannonball. It struck the right frontal area of Senna's yellow helmet with devastating force, shoving his head back against the headrest and fracturing his skull. A piece of suspension attached to the wheel partially penetrated his Bell M3 helmet. Simultaneously, a jagged piece of the upright assembly pierced through the helmet visor just above his right eye. Any single injury would have killed him. All of them together was an unthinkably horrific and unpredictable tragedy. The Italian Supreme Court of Cassation later ruled that mechanical failure caused the crash, specifically the hastily modified steering column that Senna had requested for comfort, compromising the structural integrity of the car. The deaths at Imola triggered immediate reforms. By the Spanish Grand Prix just 2 races later, teams were forced to reduce downforce through modified wing designs, speed limits appeared in pit lanes, electronic aids remained banned, and the circuits underwent massive reconstruction, with Tamburello itself transformed from a deadly flat-out corner into a low-speed chicane. To this day, nobody has suffered a more brutal fate than Ayrton Senna. Kevin Pierce, snowboarding. Kevin Pierce was 22 and unstoppable in the world of snowboarding. December 2009 found him in Park City, Utah, perfecting the cab double cork, a trick involving 2 flips while spinning, the kind of move that separates the truly great Olympic medalists from, well, everyone else. He'd already beaten Shaun White multiple times and was considered America's best shot at halfpipe gold in Vancouver. With the Olympics weeks away, nobody had any doubt that he would be the one to pull this off. The halfpipe at Park City stretched 22 feet high, with riders flying even higher on momentum. Pierce was not the least bit worried, having landed this trick thousands of times before. But on New Year's Eve, his snowboard caught the edge of the pipe during the cab double cork. He slammed face first into the icy wall, striking his head just above his left eye. The helmet he wore saved his life, but it couldn't prevent what happened next. Pierce lay unconscious on the snow as paramedics airlifted him to University of Utah Medical Center, where doctors diagnosed severe traumatic brain injury with potentially lethal brain swelling. To give his brain time to heal, they put him into a medically induced coma for 10 days. When Pierce finally woke up, doctors weren't sure if he'd recognize his family or even walk again. He spent a month in critical care before being stable enough to transfer to Craig Hospital in Denver, a specialized brain injury rehabilitation center where he spent 4 months in intensive therapy designed to help him relearn basic human functions. The injury destroyed everything Pierce had worked for. His memory, vision, concentration, and coordination were permanently damaged. He had to relearn how to walk and talk. Simple tasks like remembering where he left his keys became impossible, and the competitive snowboarding career that had defined his entire life was over. There was simply no chance he would ever be able to ride again. Well, 2 years later, Pierce finally returned to snowboarding. Not for competition, but just to ride around. He had once been America's Olympic hope. Now he was relearning how to exist in a world where his brain would never work the same way again. Level 4. Remco Evenepoel, cycling. On August 15, 2020, Belgian cyclist Remco Evenepoel was flying down the Muro di Sormano at 85 kilometers per hour. He had never ridden this particular descent before, but he was chasing the leaders with about 40 kilometers left in Il Lombardia. Coming through a sharp left turn, the front 3 riders made it safely, but Evenepoel didn't. He misjudged the corner completely, going wide at catastrophic speed. His momentum carried him straight into the low stone wall of an upcoming bridge, the impact launching him over the barrier and into the ravine below. When the first people arrived at the crash site, they found only his bike standing against the wall, no rider. Looking down into the ravine revealed a sight that left viewers utterly shocked. Evenepoel had fallen 30 feet into the valley, the equivalent height of a 3-story building. The cameras captured everything. Race footage showed medics rushing to the scene, finding him conscious but lying at the bottom of a steep slope. They fitted him with a precautionary neck brace and strapped him to a backboard before carrying him into the waiting ambulance. X-rays at Como Hospital revealed a fractured pelvis and right lung contusion, but the fracture was specifically at the head of his femur and in the pelvic area. His promising 2020 season was over. He had won 4 stage races that year and entered Il Lombardia as the race favorite. Now, he was hospitalized. But all things considered, the crash could have been far worse. Evenepoel avoided the deeper areas of the ravine, and the forest floor's thick layers of leaves helped cushion his fall. 9 months later, he returned to racing in the 2021 Giro d'Italia, which, in a way, is one hell of a miracle. Caleb Moore, snowmobile. Caleb Moore was a young Texan who had made the leap from ATVs to snowmobiles, spending 2 weeks specifically to learn how to pull off a backflip. He had spent his time training by launching into foam pits his father built in their backyard. Now he was about to attempt the same trick on a snowmobile, something he had never done before. He was number 31 at the Winter X Games 17 on January 24th, with 15,000 spectators watching from the Aspen, Colorado mountainside. He prepared himself for the backflip, setting off for the stunt he had been practicing. But the skis caught the lip of the landing area. Moore flew over the handlebars, his body separating from the 450-pound machine and landing him face first in the snow. The snowmobile followed, rolling over him with its full weight. Moore stayed down for several minutes. When he finally stood, he needed help walking, clearly struggling with the pain of the impact. Medical staff treated him for what appeared to be a concussion, but the crowd assumed he'd be fine. Crashes were part of the sport, and Moore had always bounced back before. Why would they be concerned? What they didn't know was that Moore had developed bleeding around his heart, a cardiac contusion that required emergency surgery. Doctors flew him to Grand Junction, Colorado, but before he reached the hospital, he suffered cardiopulmonary arrest, with his heart injury triggering a secondary complication involving his brain. The MRI revealed that he had suffered severe brain damage caused by a lack of oxygen. Moore never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead on January 31st, 1 week after the accident. The autopsy would later confirm that he died from the impact of the snowmobile rolling over him, causing multiple rib fractures and contusion of the interior chest wall. His organs were donated. Moore became the first competitor to die from injuries sustained during the X Games in the event's 18-year history. It's a haunting coincidence his brother Colton had crashed the same night, suffering a separated pelvis. Both Moore brothers went down within hours of each other, but only one would leave the hospital alive. Pritchard Colon, boxing. When Pritchard Colon entered the Eagle Bank Arena on October 17, 2015, he was undefeated and hungry for victory. This 23-year-old winner was facing Terrell Williams in what should have been another stepping stone toward a world title. Instead, Williams began landing illegal punches to the back of Colon's head from the early rounds. They're called rabbit punches, dangerous shots that target the vulnerable base of the skull where the brain stem connects. They're known to be one of the most dangerous kinds of punches a human can take. Colon complained to the referee Joe Cooper about the illegal blows, but Cooper didn't care, telling Colon, "You take care of it." So, the fight continued, and of course, Williams kept throwing the illegal shots, knowing it was basically the only way he would win. Cooper deducted just 1 point in the 7th round, but allowed the pattern to continue. Colon absorbed more punishment to the back of his head round after round. By the 9th round, Colon went down twice, his legs clearly unsteady. His corner mistakenly began removing his gloves, thinking the fight was over. When he couldn't get the gloves back on in time, Cooper disqualified Colon. As he walked to his dressing room under his own power, one arm around his mother for support, Colon's legs grew shaky. "Mommy, I cannot see," he told her in English instead of his usual Spanish. In the dressing room, Colon tried sitting in a chair and slipped to the floor, vomiting violently before he collapsed completely. Doctors discovered a massive left-side subdural hematoma, a common consequence from these illegal rabbit punches. Surgeons removed part of his skull to relieve the pressure, but the damage was irreversible. Colon slipped into a coma that lasted 221 days. When he finally emerged, he remained in a vegetative state. Nearly a decade later, he cannot walk or speak. He breathes on his own, but requires around-the-clock care, with his only communication coming through eye movements and a specialized computer. Williams was suspended from the sport after the incident, but neither he nor the referee Joe Cooper has ever made a public apology for their role in the incident. Level 5. Antoine Hubert, F2 Racing. It was August 31st, 2019, and the Formula 2 feature race at Spa-Francorchamps was heading into its second lap. 22 Formula 2 cars were threading through the legendary Eau Rouge Radion complex at racing speed. Among them, Antoine Hubert sat in his Arden car following the pack up the famous climb when everything started falling apart ahead of him. Giuliano Alesi's right rear tire had been slowly losing pressure, a mechanical failure that was going to define the whole race. As Alesi climbed the Radion curve, the compromised tire finally gave way completely, sending his Trident car spinning sideways into the left barrier. The impact tore his rear wing and scattered carbon fiber debris across the racing line. Ralph Boschung crested the hill and saw the wreckage spread before him, immediately slowing and moving right toward the runoff area. But behind him, Hubert couldn't see where Boschung had gone or why he was suddenly so much slower. The speed difference between the two cars created a blind spot that would prove fatal. Hubert moved right as well, his front wing clipping Boschung's rear wheel and instantly destroying his car's aerodynamics. Without his front wing, Hubert's car became a 162-mile-per-hour projectile that slammed into the right side tire barrier at a 40-degree angle. The barrier deflected him back toward the middle of the track, where his car came to rest virtually stationary. The whole time, Juan Manuel Correa was dealing with his own crisis. His suspension had been damaged after hitting the debris from Alesi's disintegrated car. Traveling at 218 kilometers per hour, Correa struck the left side of Hubert's motionless car in a T-bone collision that generated 81.8 G-forces on Hubert's chassis. Both cars disintegrated on impact. Hubert didn't stand a chance. The FIA investigation found no single cause and blamed no driver, concluding that Hubert died from non-survivable trauma caused by the extreme energy transfer. The whole accident sequence had lasted exactly 14.6 seconds. Fabio Casertelli, cycling. The 1995 Tour de France was unfolding as expected when the riders approached stage 15 on July 18th. Fabio Casertelli, the 24-year-old Italian Olympic champion, rode with his American Motorola teammates through the Pyrenees, including the pre-disgraced Lance Armstrong and Frankie Andro. The stage stretched 206 kilometers from Saint-Girons to Cauderay, featuring the treacherous Col de Porte d'Aspect descent. What made this particular descent so notoriously dangerous was the narrow road combined with speeds reaching 55 miles per hour. Riders regularly hit 70 kilometers per hour on these mountain descents, and most chose not to wear helmets despite the obvious risks. The concrete blocks lining the roadside were designed to be barriers, but their sharp edges created lethal hazards for anyone who lost control. Casertelli was traveling in a small group when they hit a longer curve than the others. French rider Francois Simon, riding behind him, watched as Casertelli's back wheel clipped the side of the road. Suddenly, he flew through the air and slammed head first into one of those concrete barriers. Blood poured from his head as he laid motionless on the pavement in a fetal position. Dr. Gerard Porte, the Tour's chief medical officer, arrived within 10 seconds and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. The massive amount of bleeding indicated an extremely powerful impact, and the whole thing was being broadcast live by television cameras. The helicopter evacuation began immediately, but Casertelli suffered 3 cardiac arrests during the flight to Tarbes Hospital, eventually being pronounced dead 30 minutes after arrival. His heart had stopped multiple times, but the true cause of death was brain trauma from the concrete impact. The following day, the peloton rode in complete silence. His 6 Motorola teammates crossed the finish line together, with Italian Andrea Perron taking the stage victory. The cycling world had lost its 3rd Tour de France fatality in 92 years. Nick Zoricek, skiing. Nick Zoricek approached the final jump at Grindelwald with the finishing line in sight. The 29-year-old Canadian had been racing ski cross for just 4 years, but this World Cup event in Switzerland should have been pretty typical and easy for him. But when Zoricek launched off that last jump, everything went wrong. He went wide to the right, his trajectory carrying him completely off course. Instead of landing on groomed snow like every other racer, Zoricek hit what his family's lawyer would later call absolute crud. Ungroomed, hardened snow that caught his skis and sent him tumbling forward. The safety netting was designed for skiers sliding out at angles, not for someone landing beside it at full speed, which means that it was not built to absorb his impact. Instead, it launched him into the air, throwing him directly into a frozen snowbank positioned right at the finish line. Television cameras captured everything, even the moment that Zorosic's body went motionless. His skis and poles scattered across the course, and the competitors who crossed the finish line looked back to see their friend lying completely still. A helicopter airlifted him to Interlaken Hospital, where at 12:35 p.m. Swiss time, doctors pronounced him dead from severe neurotrauma. The entire event was immediately canceled. What happened next sparked years of bitter controversy. Zorosic's family hired prominent lawyer Tim Danson, who called the finish area a death trap. They showed frame-by-frame video analysis proving the course design was fundamentally flawed, but Swiss police ignored it, claiming that the incident was simply a sporting accident. The family demanded an independent investigation, and other racers admitted they had complained about the dangerous final jump before the race. The International Ski Federation remained largely silent, knowing that anything they said would be used against them. Jimmy Doyle, boxing. Sugar Ray Robinson was supposed to defend his welterweight title for the first time against Jimmy Doyle on June 24, 1947 in Cleveland. The 22-year-old challenger had reeled off 5 straight victories to earn his shot at the championship. Doyle, on the other hand, was already fighting on borrowed time. California's boxing commission wouldn't sanction him anymore after he'd taken several brutal knockouts there, which meant that Cleveland was his last chance to prove he wasn't damaged goods. The night before the fight, Robinson had a dream. In it, he saw himself in the ring with Doyle. A few good punches later, Doyle was flat on his back, blank eyes staring up at nothing. The referee started counting, but people in the crowd were chanting, "He's dead, he's dead." Robinson woke up in a cold sweat, screaming for Jimmy to get up. The dream disturbed Robinson so much that he wanted to cancel the entire fight, but his manager brushed it off as nonsense. Their compromise was to bring in a priest and a minister who convinced him it was just a dream, nothing more. Robinson reluctantly agreed to step into the ring. Eventually, June 24th arrived. Robinson dominated every round except the 6th, when Doyle staggered him twice and opened a cut over his eye. In the 8th round, Robinson threw a devastating left hook that traveled only 6 inches. Doyle's body stiffened, and he fell backwards like his heels were hinged to the floor. His head bounced off the canvas with a sickening thud. The bell rang as the referee reached 9, technically saving Doyle from a complete knockout. But Doyle never got up. His handlers worked frantically with cold water and smelling salts, but he remained unconscious. Stretcher bearers carried him to St. Vincent's Charity Hospital, where he died 17 hours later from a brain hemorrhage and blood clot. Robinson stood over the fallen fighter, transfixed, watching his nightmare become a horrible reality. The dream had warned him exactly what would happen, and everyone convinced him he was crazy, allowing this disaster to unfold. Level 6. Frank Hayes, horse racing. Frank Hayes was desperate. The 22-year-old Irish trainer had just one shot at his dream of becoming a jockey. He weighed 142 pounds, which was far too heavy for the June 4th, 1923 steeplechase at Belmont Park. Sweet Kiss, the 20-to-1 outsider he'd been assigned to ride, wasn't expected to finish in the top 5. Hayes had days to drop 12 pounds or lose his only chance. He went at the weight loss with the devotion of a fanatic, barely eating enough to, and I quote, suffice for an anchorite, while subjecting himself to grueling exercise routines. In days, he went from 142 to 130 pounds, an insane transformation that took a brutal toll. On race morning, Hayes appeared visibly weak and exhausted as he climbed into the saddle, but he was optimistic. Hayes, wearing Ms. A.M. Frayling's racing silks, had told fellow jockeys earlier, "Today's a good day to make history." Toward the end of his 2-mile, 12-jump race, Frank Hayes suffered a massive heart attack that made his body go limp. Yet Sweet Kiss continued running, carrying what was now dead weight toward the finish line. The horse jumped the final fence with Hayes' lifeless body still mounted. She crossed the finish line first, winning by a head against fan favorite Gimme. The crowd erupted in celebration for this stunning upset. Sweet Kiss cantered an additional 100 yards before Hayes' body finally slipped sideways and tumbled to the ground. Miss Frayling and race officials approached to congratulate the winning jockey, only to find him face down in the dirt, motionless. Track doctor John A. Voorhees examined the body and immediately pronounced Hayes dead at the scene. Suddenly, the celebration stopped. All post-race formalities were abandoned. Frank Hayes became the first and, to date, only jockey to win an official race while dead. He was buried 3 days later, dressed in his racing silks. Sweet Kiss never raced again, earning the nickname Sweet Kiss of Death. But at least Frank died, achieving his lifelong dream. Chuck Hughes, NFL. On October 24, 1971, the Lions were hosting the Chicago Bears at Tiger Stadium, Detroit, trailing 28-23 in the fourth quarter. But then, they got a shot. Larry Walton twisted his ankle on a routine play, limping off the field as the clock ticked down. Chuck Hughes jogged onto the turf as his replacement, a 28-year-old backup receiver who'd caught exactly 0 passes that season. Okay, maybe they didn't have a chance. In fact, Hughes had been sick for weeks. Just a month and a half earlier, he'd collapsed in a locker room after a preseason game against Buffalo, hospitalized with what doctors thought might be a spleen injury, but they found nothing definitive, allowing him to continue playing through chest pain and what he called acid reflux, insisting the discomfort wasn't that bad. He was wrong. Actually, his arteries were already 75% clogged. The Lions needed a miracle drive. Quarterback Greg Landry found Hughes immediately for 32 yards, setting up first down in Chicago's 37-yard line. But suddenly, 2 Bears defenders hit him simultaneously, one high, one low, in a perfectly legal tackle that might have dislodged something critical inside his chest. Hughes climbed up slowly, walked back to the huddle like nothing happened. 3 plays later, Landry threw toward the end zone for tight end Charlie Sanders, but the pass fell incomplete. Hughes had run a decoy route, stopping at the 15-yard line before turning back toward his teammates. That's when he locked eyes with Dick Butkus, the Bears' legendary linebacker. For just a moment, they stared at each other across the field. Then Hughes' eyes rolled back in his head. He dropped to the turf at the 20-yard line, clutching his chest, his body convulsing violently. Butkus frantically waved towards the sidelines for help as medical personnel sprinted onto the field with just 62 seconds remaining on the game clock. They loaded Hughes into an ambulance while the teams finished the final minute of play. The Bears held their lead, but at Henry Ford Hospital, doctors pronounced Chuck Hughes dead at 5:34 p.m. He remains the only NFL player to die during a game. Becky Zerlance, boxing. Becky Zerlance stepped into the Denver Coliseum on April 2, 2005, planning for this Colorado Gold Gloves match to be her farewell to boxing. She wasn't even a professional. She was a 34-year-old geography professor who saw this as her exit strategy. One last title chase before hanging up her gloves for good. Her opponent, 32-year-old Heather Schmitz, stood across the ring. The first 2 rounds played out with Zerlance winning. Then, 90 seconds into the 3rd round, Schmitz threw a straight right cross that connected with Zerlance's left temple. Zerlance staggered briefly, then collapsed face first onto the canvas. She was wearing the required protective equipment, but headgear, despite its protective appearance, cannot stop the brain from jarring inside the skull when the head snaps back from impact. Ringside physicians rushed to fit an oxygen mask over her face within 25 seconds, quickly rushing her to Denver Health Medical Center, where surgeons performed emergency neurosurgery to relieve the building intracranial pressure. None of it mattered. CT scans revealed catastrophic bleeding and irreparable brain swelling. Zerlance never regained consciousness. She died the following afternoon from blunt force trauma. The Denver County coroner's autopsy found no pre-existing conditions, no drugs or alcohol, nothing that could explain why this single punch proved fatal. But Becky Zerlance became the first woman in U.S. history to die from injuries sustained in a sanctioned boxing match, making her farewell match a tragic end to a great amateur career. Lane Frost, bull riding. July 30th, 1989 was Rodeo Day at Cheyenne Frontier Days. Lane Frost, the 1987 PRCA World Champion, drew a Brahma bull named Taking Care of Business from chute number 7. Frost was 25 years old, looking to make his 6th consecutive National Finals rodeo appearance memorable. He'd get his wish, just not the way he'd want. The ride itself went perfectly. Frost stayed on the full 8 seconds, earning an impressive 85-point score, but his dismount went wrong. He landed awkwardly in the bull's direct line of sight right in front of the animal. The bull stepped on Frost's leather chaps, trapping him in place. In seconds, the bull's right horn hooked Frost in the back with the animal's full body weight behind it. The horn never broke through his skin, but the blunt force impact shattered several ribs, sending one rib fragment right through his heart. Another punctured his lungs. Frost somehow managed to stand up after the blow. He took a few steps toward the bucking chutes where his longtime friend, Tough Headman, was watching. Frost motioned with his hands that he needed help, then collapsed face first into the muddy arena floor. Dr. Skip Ross was the first responder to reach him, but the internal damage was too severe. Ross worked for 90 minutes trying to save him despite knowing it was something you couldn't fix. At 3:59 p.m., Lane Frost was pronounced dead. Before this day, protective equipment was optional in bull riding, with cowboys wearing nothing but shirts for protection. But having witnessed this, Frost's friend, Cody Lambert, was motivated to design the first protective vest for bull riders. By 1996, protective vests became mandatory for all professional bull riders. Christian Eriksen, heart attack. Denmark was playing Finland in their Euro 2020 opener on June 12, 2021, when the unthinkable happened in the 43rd minute. Christian Eriksen, the 29-year-old midfielder, had just received a throw-in when he suddenly stumbled and collapsed face first into the Copenhagen pitch. There was no contact, he simply dropped. Finnish and Danish players frantically gestured for help while Eriksen laid motionless, unconscious, his pulse slipping away. Denmark's team doctor, Morten Boesen, reached him first and felt a heartbeat, but then everything changed. What followed were 10 minutes of desperate medical intervention broadcast live to millions. The team doctor started chest compressions immediately, while Eriksen's teammates formed a protective circle around their fallen colleague, shielding the resuscitation attempts from cameras and spectators. The stadium fell into an eerie quiet as medics worked frantically to save his life. This was going to end well or badly. Eriksen had suffered cardiac arrest and required intensive CPR before receiving one shock from a defibrillator. That single electric pulse was enough to restart his heart, narrowly saving his life. If they had waited one more minute, there's no telling what could have happened. After more than 15 minutes of on-field treatment, Eriksen was carried off conscious, even managing to wave to fans from his stretcher. The match resumed hours later after both teams agreed to continue, with Finland winning 1-0. 8 months later, fitted with an implanted cardioverter defibrillator, Eriksen made his Brentford debut. When he returned to international football, he scored within 2 minutes of entering the match. Now that's a comeback. Jan Mardenborough, racing. On March 28, 2015, VLN Endurance Championship weekend was in full swing at the Nürburgring Nordschleife. Jan Mardenborough, the former Gran Turismo gamer turned professional driver, strapped into his Nissan GTR Nismo GT3 for a 4-hour race. Little did he know, he was about to become the center of motorsport's worst nightmare. Less than 90 minutes into the race, Mardenborough approached Flugplatz, a notorious section where cars regularly lift off the ground. The corner's name literally translates to airfield, but his Nissan launched skyward with its nose pointing almost straight up. The car struck the tire barriers vertically, then cartwheeled through space like a deadly projectile. Within seconds, the GTR had sailed completely over the catch fencing and crashed down into the spectator area, landing upside down among the crowd. Martinborough climbed out of the wreckage unscathed, a fact that would haunt him more than any physical injury could, because one spectator was dead and several others required hospitalization. The race was immediately red flagged as emergency services rushed to the scene. The German Motorsport Association, DMSB, acted quickly, imposing an immediate ban on old GT3 cars from the Nordschleife pending investigation. Speed limits were implemented across multiple sections of the circuit. Track officials knew they were staring at a fundamental problem. Cars had become too fast for a circuit designed in 1927. Martinborough was taken to the hospital for routine checks, but the real damage was psychological, as he grappled with survivor's guilt. The circuit was rebuilt into something safer, but he would never be able to fully move on. Level 7. Gernot Reinstadler, skiing. Gernot Reinstadler was hailed to be Austria's next downhill star. At 20 years old, he was among the most promising talents on the Austrian speed team, training for the qualifying session at Wengen's legendary Lauberhorn course on January 18, 1991. The Lauberhorn was known for being the longest downhill on the World Cup circuit, but it wasn't supposed to be a killer. Reinstadler entered the final S-curve at full speed, a section where racers typically hit their highest velocities before the finish. But for him, something went wrong. He lost control completely, his body hurtling towards the safety barriers that were meant to protect him. The nets caught him, but not the way they were designed to. One of his skis became trapped in the safety netting. The force of his momentum at over 100 kilometers per hour created a horrific scenario. His body continued moving while his ski remained fixed. The impact essentially split his pelvis apart and nearly severed his right leg. Witnesses watched him slide semi-conscious down the slope, leaving a horrific 30-foot trail of blood clearly visible against the white snow. The medical team reached him quickly, but his pelvis was broken in two, and severe internal bleeding had already begun. A helicopter rushed him to the hospital in Interlaken, where surgeons immediately began what would become a 6-hour battle to save his life. They performed multiple blood transfusions, trying desperately to replace what he'd lost on the mountain. But no matter how hard they tried, the surgical team couldn't stop the hemorrhaging. Despite their efforts, Reinstadler died in the early hours of January 19th, never regaining consciousness after the crash. His death sent shockwaves through the skiing world and forced the immediate cancellation of that weekend's races. As a result of the incident, the organizers began making immediate modifications in net design to prevent skis from becoming trapped and to avoid losing any more young athletes. Clint Malerchuk, hockey. It was March 22nd, 1989, and it was hockey night at Buffalo's Memorial Auditorium. The Sabres were hosting the St. Louis Blues in a late-season game. Clint Malerchuk crouched in his goal just 3 weeks into his tenure with Buffalo. The first period was winding down when Steve Tuttle of the Blues came racing toward the Buffalo net. Sabres defenseman Uwe Krupp moved in to intercept, and the two players collided directly in front of Malerchuk. Their bodies tangled, momentum carried them forward, and in that split second of chaos, Tuttle's skate blade swung upward, right against the right side of Malerchuk's neck. His carotid artery was sliced open, his jugular vein partially severed. Within seconds, blood began pumping from the wound, creating an expanding pool of red on the white ice. Malerchuk immediately understood what was happening, throwing off his gloves and clutching his throat, blood seeping between his fingers. The arena fell into stunned silence, then erupted into panic, with 11 fans fainting in their seats and 2 spectators suffering heart attacks. Television cameras quickly cut away from the horrific scene. The team's athletic trainer, a Vietnam veteran named Jim Pizzatelli, rushed onto the ice. His battlefield experience with traumatic injuries proved crucial as he applied pressure to the wound while helping Malarchuk off the ice. The goalie walked to the tunnel under his own power, blood still flowing from his neck. At Buffalo General Hospital, emergency surgery revealed how close he came to death. The blade had stopped just 1 millimeter from Malarchuk's internal carotid artery. 1 millimeter deeper, and the 27-year-old would have bled out on live television. He managed to survive the ordeal. That was an extremely harrowing experience for everybody present. Griffith v. Parrott. The tension had been building for months before March 24, 1962, when Emil Griffith and Benny Kid Parrott stepped into Madison Square Garden for their third and final encounter. This wasn't just about the welterweight title anymore. Something darker had crept into their rivalry. Parrott had won their previous fight by a controversial split decision, but it was what happened at the weigh-ins that really made the end result inevitable. Standing on the scales that morning, Parrott decided to play psychological warfare with his rival. He whispered "maricón," a vicious Spanish slur targeting Griffith's orientation. In 1962, these accusations could destroy an athlete's career, and Parrott knew exactly what he was doing. Griffith had to be restrained from attacking Parrott on the spot. That night, 7,500 fans packed the Garden while millions more watched live on ABC's Fight of the Week. For 11 rounds, both men fought with controlled aggression. Parrott had even come close to stopping Griffith in the 6th round. Then came the 12th round. Griffith backed Parrott into a corner and unleashed pure fury, throwing 29 consecutive punches in seconds. Parrott's arms went limp, his head lolling helplessly as each blow landed. The referee, Ruby Goldstein, stood frozen as Parrott was knocked through the ropes. When Goldstein finally intervened, Parrott collapsed unconscious, blood clots already forming in his brain. 10 days later, despite emergency surgery to relieve the pressure, Parrott died at Roosevelt Hospital. The live television audience had witnessed a man being beaten to death in real time, sparking nationwide calls for a ban on boxing. For his part, Griffith would suffer nightmares about those punches for 40 years, blaming himself for ending the life of his sports rival. Hey, Abyssal fans, quick update before we proceed. From now on, our icebergs will be 8 levels instead of 7. However, YouTube would take our channel down if we posted content that disturbing here, so we'll be posting it exclusively to our Patreon. If you'd like to watch the exclusive 8th level while supporting us at the same time, check out the first link in our description.